The dawn sky over Truk Lagoon on the morning of February 17, 1944, held no warning. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Okazaki stood on the deck of the merchant tanker Hoyomaru, watching the first pale light touch the volcanic peaks of Dublin Island. Behind him, 31 other merchant vessels lay at anchor in the lagoon's sheltered waters, their hulls heavy with fuel oil, ammunition, and supplies meant for Japanese garrisons scattered across the Central Pacific. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed from one of the shore facilities. It was quiet. Too quiet. At 4,000 feet above the lagoon, 70 American Hellcat fighters were already descending through the darkness, their engines muffled by careful throttle control. They had launched 90 minutes before daybreak from carriers positioned 90 nautical miles northeast, invisible beyond the horizon. The pilots wore oxygen masks against the cold air, their eyes fixed on the dim silhouettes of islands emerging from the night. They had been told Truk was the Gibraltar of the Pacific. They had been told it was impregnable. In 18 minutes, they would prove otherwise. The central question of this story is deceptively simple. How did Japan's most formidable naval fortress in the Central Pacific, defended by 365 aircraft and fortified over 2 decades, fall to American carrier power in just 2 days? The answer reveals a profound truth about the Second World War in the Pacific, the collision between Japan's doctrine of static defense and America's revolution in naval aviation, between belief in fortress invincibility and the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. This is the story of Operation Hailstone. It is the story of how the United States Navy sank more than 200,000 tons of shipping in 48 hours, destroyed 275 aircraft, and rendered Japan's greatest overseas base without ever setting foot on its shores. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when strategic assumptions meet material reality, and of the 33,000 men left behind to starve on an island that had been promised eternal protection. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Truk Lagoon is a thing of geological accident and strategic perfection. 40 miles across, encircled by a barrier reef with only 5 navigable passes, it cradles within its embrace more than 200 islands, the tips of drowned volcanic mountains rising from depths that plunge to 12,000 feet. The lagoon itself provides anchorage deep enough for the largest warships, yet shallow enough near the islands for repair facilities and supply depots. It sits almost precisely equidistant from Rabaul to the south and the Marshall Islands to the east, 670 miles from each. In the vocabulary of naval warfare, Truk was what strategists call an interior position, a central node from which forces could deploy in any direction along shorter lines of communication than an enemy approaching from the periphery. The Japanese understood this immediately. When Germany lost its Pacific colonies after the First World War, the League of Nations granted Japan a mandate over the Caroline Islands, including Truk. The mandate came with explicit restrictions against fortification, but the Japanese began developing Truk's infrastructure almost immediately. By 1939, when the restrictions had become diplomatically meaningless, construction accelerated. 5 airfields rose on the islands of Eton, Param, Moan, and Dublin. A seaplane base appeared on Moan's eastern shore. Repair facilities, dry docks, fuel storage tanks capable of holding 77,200 tons of oil, the largest depot outside the Japanese home islands. Underground command bunkers, radio stations, a naval hospital, housing for what would eventually become 28,000 naval personnel and 7,500 army troops. The fortification of Truk represented more than military engineering. It embodied a strategic philosophy inherited from European colonial powers who had held the Pacific for centuries before Japan. The belief that heavily fortified bases, properly supplied and defended, could control vast ocean spaces through the threat of their mere existence. The British in Singapore, the Americans at Manila, the Germans at Qingdao. All had operated on the assumption that a fortress, once established, became an immovable fact around which naval strategy must navigate. Japan's pre-war naval doctrine had absorbed this thinking completely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had even visited Truk personally in 1942, bringing the super battleship Yamato to anchor in the lagoon as both a practical headquarters and a symbol, the mightiest warship in the world sheltered by the mightiest fortress in the Pacific. But fortresses require assumptions to remain invincible. They assume the enemy cannot project sufficient power to overwhelm defenses. They assume supply lines remain intact. They assume, critically, that the fortress itself remains strategically relevant, that the enemy must come to it rather than simply bypass it. By early 1944, every one of these assumptions was beginning to fracture. The Japanese garrison at Truk in February 1944 numbered approximately 12,000 men directly involved in military operations, with thousands more in support roles. They manned 40 major anti-aircraft guns positioned to cover the 5 reef passes and the anchorage areas. The fire control radar that should have guided these guns with precision sat at the bottom of the Pacific, lost when an American submarine torpedoed the transport bringing it from Japan. Still, the guns themselves were formidable. 88mm weapons capable of reaching 30,000 feet. The Japanese crews had drilled for months. They knew the approach angles. They had calculated firing solutions for every conceivable attack vector. The real strength of Truk, however, lay in its aircraft. Between 300 and 400 planes operated from the 5 airfields at any given time. The number fluctuated as aircraft were shuttled to and from other bases, but pre-raid inventories documented approximately 365 aircraft present on February 16th. Most were Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, legendary for their range and maneuverability in the war's early years. Others included Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, reassigned from carrier duty to land-based operations, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, Kawanishi H-8K flying boats from the seaplane base. The 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas, both experienced units, provided the pilots. These men had flown combat missions over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines. They understood their role: to intercept any approaching American force while still hundreds of miles from Truk, before carrier aircraft could reach their launching positions. The Japanese called Truk Torokushima, Truk Island, but American intelligence had given it another name, the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The comparison was deliberate. Like Gibraltar controlling the Mediterranean, Truk controlled the approaches to the Central Pacific. No American fleet could operate safely in the Marshalls, the Marianas, or the Carolines, while Japanese aircraft from Truk threatened their supply lines. Neutralizing Truk was not merely desirable. It was necessary. But the Americans faced a problem. Truk's garrison, its gun positions, its airfields built into mountainous terrain, all of this made a conventional amphibious assault potentially catastrophic. The recent battle for Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands had demonstrated the cost of attacking a fortified position. Tarawa's garrison numbered only 4,500 men on an island barely 3 miles long. American casualties had reached 3,300 in 76 hours of fighting. Truk held 3 times the garrison on terrain infinitely more defensible. Early American estimates suggested that taking Truk by amphibious assault could produce 10,000 casualties or more. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, proposed an alternative. Rather than invade Truk, he would destroy it from the air and sea. The instrument for this destruction would be Task Force 58, the fast carrier force under Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher. Mark Andrew Mitcher had grown up with naval aviation from its earliest experimental days. He had served on the Navy's first carrier, the Langley, when carrier operations still involved wooden flight decks and aircraft that could barely lift themselves into the air. By 1944, he commanded a force that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. 5 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, each capable of carrying 90 aircraft. 4 light carriers, Belleau-Wood, Cabot, Monterey, and Cowpens. 6 battleships, including the Iowa with its 16-inch guns, cruisers, destroyers. More than 500 combat aircraft in total. The entire task force consumed fuel at a rate that required dedicated oiler tankers trailing behind just to keep the ships operational. Mitcher's command style was simple. "I tell them what I want done," he once explained, "not how." His subordinate commanders appreciated this. Unlike some admirals who micromanaged every tactical decision, Mitcher set objectives and trusted his air group commanders to execute. The objective for Operation Hailstone, as the Truk raid was codenamed, was equally simple. Destroy Japanese air power at Truk, sink or damage every ship in the lagoon, and render the base useless for future operations. The operation would coincide with American landings at Eniwetok in the western Marshall Islands, 669 miles to the east. Truk's aircraft could not be allowed to interfere with that invasion. The first indication something was wrong came on February 4, 1944. 2 U.S. Marine Corps B-24 Liberator bombers flying from Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, a distance of more than 1,000 miles each way, conducted the first high-altitude photographic reconnaissance of Truk. Japanese radar detected the aircraft, but at their operating altitude of 30,000 feet, anti-aircraft fire proved ineffective. The Liberators returned with hundreds of photographs showing what American planners had only guessed at: the full extent of Truk's facilities, the exact locations of airfields, the positions of ships at anchor. The Japanese garrison at Truk understood immediately what reconnaissance flights meant. For 2 weeks, the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas maintained maximum alert. Pilots slept in their flight suits. Mechanics kept aircraft fueled and armed. Radar operators scanned the skies constantly for signs of an approaching carrier force. The entire base operated on 4 hours of sleep and raw nerves. By February 16th, those nerves had frayed to breaking. No American carriers had appeared. No attack had materialized. That afternoon, Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commanding the 4th Fleet from his headquarters on Dublin Island, authorized shore leave for the air flotillas. The pilots had been on high alert for 14 days. They needed rest. The carriers, if they were coming at all, would not arrive for at least another 24 hours. Kobayashi's intelligence staff had calculated the distances. The Americans would need time to position their forces. There would be a warning. There was no warning. Task Force 58 had approached Truk from the northeast under radio silence, maintaining a course that kept them beyond the range of Japanese patrol aircraft. Spruance had positioned his battleships and cruisers in Task Group 50.9, a surface action group under Rear Admiral Willis Lee, to circumnavigate Truk and engage any ships attempting to flee. The carriers remained 90 nautical miles out, far enough to avoid land-based bombers, close enough to launch strikes at dawn. At 4:43 on the morning of February 17th, the light carriers began launching aircraft in a staggered sequence, creating a continuous stream of strike aircraft arriving over Truk throughout the morning. The innovation was deliberate. Instead of massed strikes that gave defenders time to react between waves, American aircraft would appear over the target in an unending procession, maintaining pressure and preventing the Japanese from reorganizing their defenses. The initial fighter sweep consisted of 74 Grumman F-6F Hellcats. The Hellcat had entered service in 1943 as the Navy's answer to the Zero. It was heavier, less maneuverable, but faster and far more durable. A Zero could outturn a Hellcat in a dogfight, but Hellcat pilots didn't dogfight. They used superior speed and teamwork to engage on their terms, diving from altitude, making a single firing pass, and climbing away before the Zero could respond. The Hellcat carried 6 half-inch caliber machine guns, each capable of 700 rounds per minute. Against the Zero's light construction, these weapons were devastatingly effective. The fighter sweep crossed Truk's barrier reef at precisely 6:15, arriving over Aten, Param, Moen, and Dublin Islands just as the sun broke the eastern horizon. Below them, Japanese aircraft sat in neat rows on the airfields, Zeros, Bettys, reconnaissance planes, all exposed on the tarmac. The pilots of the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas were still in their barracks, sleeping off 14 days of exhausting alert. The radar operators on Truk had tracked nothing because American fighters, approaching at wave-top height, had remained below the radar's coverage. Japan's defensive radar system, designed to detect high-altitude bombers, could not see aircraft flying at 500 feet. What happened next unfolded with the mechanical efficiency of industrial slaughter. The Hellcats rolled into their attack runs at 400 miles per hour, guns already firing before they leveled out above the runways. Zeros disintegrated under streams of half-inch bullets. Fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. Ammunition stores on the parked aircraft detonated in chains of secondary explosions. Japanese pilots sprinted from their barracks toward their aircraft, pulling on flight gear as they ran, but the Hellcats were already overhead, circling, waiting. A few Zeros managed to get airborne, struggling to gain altitude with enemy fighters already above them. Most never cleared the runway. The pilot accounts from that morning describe targets beyond counting. Lieutenant Commander John Phillips, leading a division from the Enterprise, reported destroying 7 aircraft on the ground in his first pass alone. Another pilot from Yorktown claimed 9. The numbers became meaningless. After 15 minutes, Eaton Island's airfield was a mass of burning wreckage, black smoke climbing thousands of feet into the morning air. Parham's field fared no better. On Dublin Island, Japanese gunners finally brought their anti-aircraft weapons into action, but the Hellcats had already completed their initial strikes. By 7 o'clock, 2/3 of Truk's air power, aircraft that had been dispersed across 5 airfields precisely to prevent such losses, had been destroyed on the ground. Some Japanese pilots did manage to engage. The ensuing dogfight would become one of the largest aerial battles of the Pacific War. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky over Truk Lagoon. Hellcats in blue-gray camouflage, Zeros in their distinctive green paint, all tangled in a 3-dimensional melee that ranged from sea level to 20,000 feet. Zero pilots used their superior maneuverability to attempt traditional turning fights. Hellcat pilots refused to cooperate, maintaining speed and altitude advantage, working in pairs to cover each other. The mathematics of the engagement favored the Americans overwhelmingly. For every Hellcat shot down, 3 or 4 Zeros fell into the lagoon or smashed into the volcanic peaks. By mid-morning, American dive bombers and torpedo bombers began arriving in successive waves. Their targets were not aircraft but ships, the 32 merchant vessels, the tankers, the destroyers, and cruisers that remained in the lagoon. The Japanese merchant captain Shigeru Fukudome, commanding the transport Fujisan Maru, watched from his bridge as Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attacks. They came from the sun, he would later tell interrogators. One moment the sky was empty, the next moment they were already in their dives, and there was nothing we could do. The Fujisan Maru took 3 direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs. The ship's cargo, trucks, ammunition, construction equipment meant for garrison reinforcement, went to the bottom with the vessel. The tanker Hoyomaru, where Lieutenant Commander Okazaki had stood watching dawn break, became the personal target of future Rear Admiral James Ramage, commanding Bombing Squadron 10 from the Enterprise. Ramage's Dauntless put 2 bombs into the Hoyomaru's deck, rupturing fuel tanks and starting fires that would burn for 6 hours before the ship finally sank. Okazaki survived by abandoning ship, swimming to Dublin Island through oil-slicked water, while American aircraft continued their attacks overhead. The most spectacular destruction came at midday when Lieutenant James Bridges, flying a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber from the Intrepid, lined up his attack run on the Ikoku Maru. The Ikoku Maru was no ordinary merchant vessel. Converted from a passenger liner, it served as an auxiliary cruiser and ammunition ship, its holds packed with depth charges, shells, and torpedoes meant for submarines and destroyers throughout the Central Pacific. Bridges' torpedo struck amidships. The explosion that followed obliterated the Ikoku Maru completely, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris 3,000 feet into the air. The blast wave was powerful enough to damage ships anchored 500 yards away. Bridges and his 3-man crew disappeared in the explosion, killed instantly by the same successful attack they had executed. Throughout the afternoon of February 17th, American strike aircraft maintained their relentless pressure. 30 distinct airstrikes were conducted during the first day alone, delivering 369,000-pound bombs, 498 500-pound bombs, and 70 torpedoes into targets across Truk. The innovation of continuous strikes, what Mitchell called the conveyor belt, prevented Japanese defenders from any meaningful reorganization. Every time anti-aircraft crews attempted to reposition guns or salvage damaged aircraft, another wave of American bombers appeared overhead. Every attempt to move supplies or evacuate wounded was interrupted by strafing runs. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. There was no safe moment, no opportunity to breathe. Japanese gunners fought with desperate courage. The 40 major anti-aircraft guns positioned around the lagoon put up intense fire, filling the sky with exploding shells. Without fire control radar, however, their effectiveness remained limited. Gunners aimed by sight and sound, firing at aircraft already maneuvering away from their predicted trajectories. Some American aircraft were hit. 25 would be lost during the 2-day operation, but the majority pressed home their attacks and returned safely to their carriers. Rescue procedures, carefully planned in advance, proved remarkably effective. Submarines positioned near Truk specifically for this purpose rescued downed air crews. In one case, a Kingfisher float plane launched from the heavy cruiser Baltimore flew directly into the lagoon under fire, landed, retrieved a downed Hellcat pilot, and took off again while 9 other Hellcats circled overhead holding a Japanese destroyer at bay. The submarine Sea Raven rescued the entire 3-man crew of a Yorktown Avenger after they ditched in the ocean. As darkness fell on February 17th, the Americans had already achieved their primary objectives. Japanese air power at Truk had been effectively destroyed. More than 200 aircraft lay burning on airfields or submerged in the lagoon. 18 merchant vessels had been sunk or were sinking. Fuel storage facilities on Dublin Island burned with flames visible for 50 miles. Admiral Kobayashi, watching from his command bunker, understood that Truk as a functioning naval base had ceased to exist in a single day. But the humiliation was not yet complete. The Japanese response came after dark. Small groups of bombers, twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers from both Truk and Formosa, attempted to locate Task Force 58 and strike back at the American carriers. They flew in groups of 1 to 3 aircraft, probing the task force's defensive perimeter, searching for openings in the screen of destroyers and cruisers. American radar detected them at distances of 40 to 50 miles. Fighter direction officers vectored combat air patrols to intercept. Most of the Japanese bombers were shot down before reaching the carriers. One got through. At approximately 10:45 on the evening of February 17th, a single Betty bomber from the 755th Air Group, what the Japanese called the Genzan Air Group, evaded the fighter screen and approached Task Group 58.2 where the carrier Intrepid operated. The bomber's pilot, flying at wavetop height to avoid radar detection, climbed to attack altitude only at the last moment. Destroyers opened fire, the night sky lit with tracer rounds. The Betty, already damaged by anti-aircraft fire, pressed its attack and released a single torpedo. The torpedo ran true, striking Intrepid's starboard quarter at 10:51. The explosion killed 11 sailors instantly and jammed the carrier's steering mechanism. Intrepid began circling uncontrollably, unable to maintain course. The Betty bomber, streaming fire from multiple hits, crashed into the ocean moments later. Damage control teams aboard Intrepid worked through the night to regain steering control. By dawn, they had jury-rigged a solution using the ship's engines at different speeds to compensate for the jammed rudder, but Intrepid could not continue combat operations. The carrier was forced to retire to Pearl Harbor and eventually to the United States for repairs. She would not return to combat until August 1944. The successful Japanese attack, the only significant blow struck against Task Force 58 during the entire operation, proved both the courage of Japanese airmen and the futility of their resistance. One carrier was damaged at the cost of more than 200 aircraft destroyed. The mathematics of attrition had become unsustainable. The second day of Operation Hailstone, February 18th, began before dawn with another innovation: the first carrier-launched night strike of the Pacific War. Aircraft departed from the carriers after midnight, using primitive navigation aids to find Truk in darkness. The night attack caught Japanese defenders completely unprepared. Anti-aircraft crews, exhausted from 36 hours of combat, struggled to track aircraft they could hear but not see. The night strikes were smaller than the previous day's massive efforts. 57 Hellcats conducted the initial sweep, but they demonstrated a tactical flexibility that Japanese forces could not match. Daylight returned. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers resumed their attacks on the remaining ships in the lagoon. 27 more vessels were sunk or damaged on the second day. The light cruisers Katori and Naka, attempting to escape through the North Pass, were caught by dive bombers and surface gunfire from Admiral Lee's battleship group. Katori took multiple bomb hits and was finished off by 16-inch shells from the battleship Iowa. The destroyer Maikaze, trying to rescue survivors from a sunken transport, was attacked by torpedo bombers and sank within minutes. The destroyer Oite, which had been escorting the cruiser Agano before that ship was torpedoed by the submarine Skate days earlier, was caught returning to Truk and destroyed by dive bombers. Admiral Spruance's Surface Action Group, Task Group 50.9, had been circling Truk throughout the operation, a steel cordon preventing escape. When Japanese ships attempted to flee through the reef passes, they ran directly into this force. The battleships Iowa and New Jersey, each displacing 45,000 tons and armed with 9 16-inch guns, engaged targets at ranges where Japanese destroyers couldn't even return fire effectively. The cruiser engagement that followed demonstrated the evolution of naval combat. Spruance's ships used radar fire control to engage in darkness and at extreme range, hitting targets the Japanese could barely see. The destroyer Burns sank the minesweeper Shonan Maru No. 15 with 5-inch gunfire. Every attempt at escape ended the same way. Detection by radar, engagement by overwhelming force, destruction. By the afternoon of February 18th, Truk Lagoon had become what would later be called the largest graveyard of ships in the world. 45 vessels rested on the bottom, representing more than 200,000 tons of shipping. The 2-day total exceeded any other naval engagement of the war for sheer tonnage destroyed in such a short period. Among the losses were assets Japan could not replace: 5 fleet tankers, precious in an empire increasingly starved for oil, 16 Navy transport ships, 3 Army transport ships, 2 submarine tenders, the light cruisers Katori and Naka, 4 destroyers, 2 submarine chasers, an auxiliary cruiser, a motor torpedo boat, hundreds of vehicles, thousands of tons of ammunition, irreplaceable supplies meant for garrisons throughout the Pacific, all now inaccessible beneath 100 feet of water. The aircraft losses were equally catastrophic. American estimates placed the number between 250 and 275 aircraft destroyed, though exact counts proved impossible given the level of destruction. More critically, Japan lost experienced pilots and aircrew. Unlike the United States, which had established extensive training programs producing thousands of new pilots annually, Japan's aircrew training had been constricted by fuel shortages and attrition. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. The 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas, veteran units with combat experience throughout the Pacific, ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. The Americans had also destroyed approximately 17,000 tons of stored fuel oil, nearly a quarter of Truk's total stockpile. Every airfield had been cratered and rendered unusable. Hangars had been demolished. The seaplane base on Moen Island was a smoking ruin. Repair facilities that had serviced the combined fleet for years were rubble. The communications center that coordinated Japanese operations across the Central Pacific had been knocked offline. Radar installations had been destroyed. Even the naval hospital had been damaged, though not deliberately targeted. American losses stood in stark contrast. 25 aircraft lost to all causes, including operational accidents. 40 men were killed, including the 29 aircrew and 11 sailors aboard Intrepid. 1 fleet carrier damaged but repairable. 1 battleship was slightly damaged by a near miss from a shore battery. These were not the casualties of a desperate struggle. They were the almost incidental costs of a systematically executed demolition. The disparity in losses revealed something profound about the nature of warfare in 1944. Operation Hailstone was not a battle in the traditional sense, a contest between roughly equal forces where courage and tactics might tip the balance. It was an industrial process, the application of overwhelming material power against an enemy who could not respond in kind. The Fast Carrier Task Force represented the full weight of American industrial mobilization. Aircraft carriers built in shipyards working 24 hours a day, aircraft produced in factories numbering them by the thousands, trained pilots emerging from training programs in Texas and Florida and California, all supported by supply chains that stretched back across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor, to San Francisco, to the factories of Detroit and the oil fields of Texas. Japan, by contrast, had reached the limit of its industrial capacity by early 1944. The combined fleet's withdrawal from Truk in the weeks before Operation Hailstone, moving the battleship Musashi and other heavy units to Palau, represented not strategic flexibility, but desperation. Japan could no longer afford to risk its remaining capital ships in positions where American carrier power might destroy them. The aircraft at Truk, the supplies, Even the garrison itself had become expendable in the brutal calculus of a losing war. Admiral Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, made the final decision regarding Truk's fate on March 12, 1944. After reviewing reconnaissance photographs and damage assessments from Operation Hailstone, he determined that Truk need not be invaded. The base could be bypassed, left to wither on the vine while American forces advanced westward toward the Mariana Islands. The decision sealed the fate of the garrison. Approximately 33,000 people remained on Truk after Operation Hailstone, 28,000 naval personnel, 5,000 Army troops, and uncounted civilians who had been working in support roles. They had food stocks calculated to last perhaps 3 months under rationing. They had limited medical supplies. The airfields could theoretically be repaired, but without aircraft to operate from them, the effort seemed pointless. The Japanese military command attempted to resupply Truk using submarines. 7 supply submarines would make the dangerous journey before the war's end, but these deliveries amounted to a fraction of what the garrison needed. By April 1944, hunger had become the garrison's primary enemy. Fishing boats that ventured into the lagoon to catch food were deliberately targeted and sunk during a second American carrier raid on April 29th. The raid destroyed an additional 93 aircraft that Japan had managed to ferry to Truk in a futile attempt to restore the base's air power. But more significantly, it sank the small craft that might have provided the garrison with supplementary food. The message was clear. Truk would receive nothing. Not reinforcements, not supplies, not even the mercy of being ignored. Starvation began to take hold by mid-1944. The garrison attempted to grow crops on the volcanic soil with limited success. Soldiers and sailors trained for combat became farmers and fishermen by necessity. Disease followed malnutrition, beriberi, dysentery, tropical ulcers that refused to heal. The naval hospital, damaged during the February attacks, struggled to treat thousands of men with almost no medicine. Surgeon Captain Iwanami Hiroshi, commanding the hospital, would later face war crimes charges for conducting medical experiments on American prisoners. But the broader horror was what happened to the Japanese garrison itself. Thousands of men slowly dying of preventable diseases and starvation, while the war moved past them toward the Philippines, toward Iwo Jima, toward Okinawa. The strategic impact of Operation Hailstone extended far beyond Truk itself. The operation paved the way for the American invasion of Eniwetok, which proceeded without interference from Truk-based aircraft. Control of Eniwetok gave the United States a forward base for further operations into the western Pacific. More critically, the neutralization of Truk enabled the invasion of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, in June 1944. These islands would become the bases from which B-29 Superfortress bombers would attack the Japanese home islands, bringing the war directly to Japan's cities and industrial centers for the first time. The Japanese defensive strategy in the Pacific had relied on a perimeter of fortified positions extending from the Yi, Kurils through the Marshalls, the Carolines, and the Marianas to the Philippines. These positions were meant to exact such heavy casualties from American forces that the United States would negotiate a peace short of total victory. Operation Hailstone demonstrated that this strategy had become obsolete. American carrier task forces could now project sufficient power to neutralize any island base without having to invade it. The bypass strategy, moving past fortified positions rather than assaulting them directly, reduced American casualties while leaving Japanese garrisons isolated and useless. The psychological impact on the Japanese military was equally significant. Truk had been considered impregnable. Its fortifications, its aircraft, its position at the heart of the Pacific, all had been presented to the Japanese public as guarantees of security. The revelation that American carrier power could destroy Truk in 2 days shattered faith in the defensive perimeter strategy. If Truk could fall so easily, what position was truly safe? The answer was becoming clear: none. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Among the wreckage in Truk Lagoon, the human cost manifested in specific, terrible ways. The merchant vessel Rio de Janeiro Maru, a 461-foot passenger cargo liner converted to a submarine tender, had arrived at Truk on February 11th, just 6 days before the attack. Her holds were packed with depth charges and coastal defense guns. When American bombs struck her on the first day, the fires that started proved impossible to control. Survivors described the chaos as ammunition cooked off in the heat, detonating randomly throughout the ship. Men jumped into the lagoon to escape the flames, swimming through oil slicks toward the nearest island. Many drowned. Others were strafed by American fighters circling overhead, unable to distinguish between sailors abandoning ship and combat swimmers attempting to reach defensive positions. The Rio de Janeiro Maru sank, with most of her crew still aboard, settling upright on the lagoon floor where her name, written in both Roman letters and Japanese kanji, each character nearly 2 feet high, remained visible to divers decades later. The San Francisco Maru, a passenger cargo vessel of 5,800 tons, met a similar fate. She had been loading trucks, bombs, mines, and other military cargo when the attack began. Multiple bomb hits opened her hull to the sea. She sank rapidly, taking with her 3 Type 95 Hago light tanks still secured in her hold, along with munitions and supplies meant for garrisons throughout the Central Pacific. The cargo, trucks, telegraph poles, mines, sake bottles for the troops, personal effects of soldiers who would never receive them, would remain preserved in the lagoon's depths, a time capsule of materials Japan could no longer afford to lose. The destroyer Fumizuki suffered not from direct hits but from near misses. A bomb that exploded close alongside her hull on February 17th caused flooding the crew could not control. Throughout the day and into the night, damage control parties worked to save the ship, but the flooding gained faster than they could pump. On February 18th, Fumizuki sank, settling to the bottom with her crew abandoning ship at the last moment. The destroyer Tachikaze had already been immobilized. She had run aground on February 4th and remained stuck when the attack began. American torpedo bombers found her helpless and sank her with multiple hits. Not all deaths came from American action. When the ammunition ship Ikoku Maru exploded, the blast wave killed Japanese sailors on neighboring vessels. Flying debris, steel plates, machinery, pieces of the ship itself rained down across hundreds of yards of the anchorage. Several smaller vessels were damaged by fragments from the explosion. The 3-man American crew aboard Lieutenant Bridges' Avenger died instantly in the blast they had caused, but so did dozens of Japanese sailors on ships that hadn't even been targeted. The ground combat troops stationed on Truk's islands watched the destruction from their defensive positions, unable to intervene. Their weapons, rifles, machine guns, small artillery pieces positioned to repel landing craft, were useless against aircraft operating at 3,000 feet or battleships firing from beyond the horizon. The soldiers had been trained and equipped to fight an amphibious invasion that would never come. Instead, they witnessed the annihilation of the naval assets they were meant to protect, an experience of impotent fury that would characterize the garrison's existence for the remaining 18 months of the war. The weather during Operation Hailstone had been perfect. Clear skies, excellent visibility, calm seas. This was both luck and careful planning. American meteorologists had studied weather patterns across the Central Pacific, identifying a window of stable conditions in mid-February. The Japanese, lacking comparable meteorological resources and cut off from weather data by American advances, could not anticipate or exploit weather changes that might have provided some protection. Even nature, it seemed, had aligned with American industrial power. The question that haunted Japanese commanders in the aftermath was simple. How had this happened? Truk had possessed every element of fortress defense: gun positions, aircraft, radar, albeit flawed, experienced troops, interior lines of communication. The answer lay not in any single failure, but in the collision of an entire strategic paradigm with material reality it could no longer accommodate. Japanese defensive doctrine assumed a relatively static battlefield, where fortified positions could control surrounding ocean space through the threat of air attack. This assumption had been valid in 1942 when American carrier forces were small and vulnerable. By 1944, the industrial capacity of the United States had produced a qualitatively different naval force. Task Force 58 could absorb casualties that would have crippled earlier carrier operations and continue fighting. It could maintain combat air patrols continuously, preventing Japanese reconnaissance from even locating the American carriers before the attack began. It could launch 500 aircraft in coordinated strikes that overwhelmed defenses through sheer numbers. More fundamentally, American doctrine had evolved to exploit advantages in industrial production and logistics. The conveyor belt strike pattern, continuous small strikes rather than massed attacks, meant Japanese defenders faced constant pressure without respite. American radar fire control allowed surface ships to engage at night and in poor visibility, negating Japan's advantage in night combat tactics. Submarine rescue of downed pilots meant aircrew losses were minimized, preserving the experienced pilots who were America's real strength. Every tactical innovation reflected an underlying material advantage that Japan could not match. The most devastating truth was that Truk's fall changed nothing about the ultimate outcome of the war. Even if the garrison had somehow repelled Operation Hailstone, even if Japanese aircraft had inflicted heavy losses on Task Force 58, the American advance would have continued. More carriers were already under construction in American shipyards. More aircraft were rolling off production lines daily. More pilots were graduating from training programs. The United States possessed what military theorists call strategic depth, the ability to absorb losses and continue operations because the industrial base producing war material exceeded what the enemy could destroy. Japan, conversely, had reached the limits of its industrial capacity by early 1944. Every ship sunk at Truk represented a loss that could not be fully replaced. Every experienced pilot killed was an irreplaceable asset. The merchant shipping destroyed in the lagoon, 200,000 tons gone in 2 days, equaled nearly 1/10 of all Japanese shipping losses between November 1st, 1943 and June 30th, 1944. At a time when Japan desperately needed merchant tonnage to move oil from the Dutch East Indies, to transport troops between threatened garrisons, to supply island outposts, the loss of 45 ships in a single operation was catastrophic. Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commanding at Truk, bore the immediate responsibility for the disaster. The Japanese Naval General Staff relieved him of command 2 days after the attack. On May 30th, 1944, Kobayashi was forced into retirement and transferred to the reserves. But his relief was largely symbolic. No different commander could have prevented what happened at Truk. The material disparity was too great. The strategic situation was too far gone. The Americans understood this. Admiral Raymond Spruance, in his after-action report, noted that Operation Hailstone had been conducted with such surprise and efficiency that enemy losses were severe while our own were minimal. The tone was professional, almost clinical. There was no boasting, no triumphalism. The raid had been a job of work, executed competently, achieving its objectives at acceptable cost. That professional detachment reflected a deeper truth. By February 1944, American commanders expected to win. The question was no longer if, but when and at what cost. Operations like Hailstone reduced that cost by demonstrating that fortified enemy positions could be neutralized without the horrific casualties of direct assault. The men abandoned on Truk understood this as well, though from a different perspective. They had been told they were the shield protecting the Empire. They had been assured that Truk's fortifications made it impregnable. In 48 hours, those assurances had been revealed as lies built on assumptions that material reality no longer supported. Now they faced months, perhaps years, of isolation and slow starvation on an island that had become strategically irrelevant. The American bypass strategy was in some ways crueler than direct assault. Death in combat at least offered meaning. Starvation on a bypassed island offered only abandonment. The strategic calculus that condemned the Truk garrison to isolation was coldly rational. American planners, studying maps of the Pacific in the spring of 1944, faced choices about resource allocation. Every division committed to invading Truk was a division unavailable for the Marianas. Every artillery shell expended on reducing Japanese bunkers was a shell not available for supporting Marines on Saipan. The question was not whether Truk could be taken. Given sufficient force, any position could be overwhelmed, but whether taking it served the strategic objective of reaching Japan's home islands. The answer was no. Truk's value had been its function as a fleet anchorage and air base threatening American supply lines. With Japanese carriers withdrawn and its aircraft destroyed, the base's geographic position became meaningless. American forces could simply sail past, maintaining air patrols to suppress any attempted rebuilding. The troops and guns on Truk's islands posed no threat to ships remaining beyond artillery range. The bypass strategy turned Truk's greatest asset, its isolation and defensibility, into a prison. This strategic irrelevance manifested in grimly practical ways for the garrison. The first months after Operation Hailstone saw attempts at normalization. Work parties cleared rubble from the airfields. Engineers jury-rigged repairs to damaged facilities. The garrison command established rationing protocols, calculating that, with strict discipline, food stocks might last through summer. They organized fishing expeditions into the lagoon, hunting parties on the jungle-covered islands. Orders were posted. Routines were established. The framework of military discipline provided structure even as the underlying purpose, defending a strategically vital base, had evaporated. But discipline could not create food where none existed. By May 1944, the daily rice ration had been cut to half normal portions. Protein came from whatever fish could be caught or wild game hunted, but 33,000 people required more food than Truk's limited ecosystem could provide sustainably. The volcanic soil supported some agriculture, sweet potatoes, taro, breadfruit, but cultivation required time and knowledge many garrison members lacked. Sailors trained to operate radar or service aircraft engines made poor farmers. The learning curve was measured in calories the garrison could not afford. The second American carrier raid on April 29th delivered another devastating blow, not through the 93 aircraft destroyed, but through the deliberate targeting of fishing boats and small craft. American pilots had received specific orders to sink any vessel, no matter how small, found operating in the lagoon. The strategic logic was clear. Deny the garrison any means of supplementing their food supply from the sea. The tactical execution was ruthlessly efficient. Fishing boats, some barely larger than canoes, were strafed and sunk. When the raid ended, Truk's garrison had lost not only its rebuilt air power, but also much of its capacity to feed itself from local resources. Hunger became the garrison's defining reality by late 1944. Medical officers documented symptoms of malnutrition appearing throughout the command. Weight loss, muscle wasting, the peculiar swelling of beriberi caused by thiamine deficiency, night blindness from vitamin A shortage, wounds that refused to heal. Men weakened by hunger contracted tropical diseases their bodies could no longer resist. Dysentery swept through camps where sanitation had degraded as work parties lacked energy for proper maintenance. Malaria, endemic to the region, found victims whose immune systems had been compromised by starvation. The submarine supply runs that reached Truk between April 1944 and the war's end brought desperately needed materials, but the quantities were absurdly insufficient. A submarine could carry perhaps 30 to 40 tons of cargo in spaces designed for torpedoes and fuel. Distributed among 33,000 people, this amounted to barely 2 pounds per person, a few days' rations at most. The submarine crews who volunteered for these missions faced American destroyer patrols, aircraft searches, and the constant risk of depth charges for the sake of deliveries that could not meaningfully change the garrison's fate. Some supplies did arrive: medical, materials, some rice, canned goods, but nothing like what the garrison needed. The mathematics were implacable. 33,000 people required approximately 33 tons of rice daily just for basic caloric needs, and that assumed rice as the sole food source. One submarine delivery, therefore, provided roughly 1 day's food for the entire garrison. 7 submarine runs over 18 months equaled 1 week of proper nutrition. The rest had to come from fishing, hunting, and agriculture that could not support the population. The psychological toll accompanied the physical deterioration. Soldiers and sailors who had trained for combat found themselves reduced to subsistence activities. The degradation of military order was gradual but inexorable. Formations became ragged as men weakened. Salutes were exchanged with less precision. The elaborate courtesies of Japanese military culture persisted, but with increasing difficulty as hunger sapped the energy required to maintain them. Some men grew bitter, angry at commanders they felt had abandoned them. Others retreated into apathy, performing only the minimum necessary to survive another day. Japanese military culture emphasized endurance and sacrifice. The garrison at Truk was repeatedly told their suffering served the empire, that by tying down American attention and resources, they contributed to the war effort. But this narrative grew harder to sustain as the war moved westward without them. News of battles in the Philippines, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, reached Truk through radio broadcasts. The garrison could hear the war continuing, but they were not participants, merely witnesses to their own abandonment. By early 1945, starvation had become the primary cause of death. The exact numbers would never be fully documented, but post-war estimates suggested thousands of the garrison died before Japan's surrender. They died slowly, their bodies consuming muscle tissue for energy, their organs failing one by one. They died of diseases that would have been survivable with adequate nutrition. They died of infected wounds that would have healed with proper medical care. Death came gradually, almost anticlimactically, in a hospital cot or a barracks or quietly in the jungle while searching for food. The native population of Truk, the Chukese people who had inhabited these islands for centuries, suffered alongside the Japanese garrison. Pre-war, perhaps 10,000 Chukese lived on the islands. The Japanese military had conscripted many for labor, building the very fortifications that were meant to protect the base. When the Americans bypassed Truk, these civilians found themselves trapped with the garrison, competing for the same inadequate food resources. Traditional fishing grounds were mined or made dangerous by sunken ships. American air patrols made venturing far from shore suicidal. The Chukese had not chosen to be part of Japan's empire or its defensive perimeter, yet they starved alongside the soldiers. The British Pacific Fleet delivered the final blow to any hope of Truk's restoration. In June 1945, as part of Operation Inmate, British carriers raided the atoll again. By this point, the garrison numbered approximately 24,000. 9,000 had died or been evacuated on the rare submarine runs. The British found minimal opposition. A few anti-aircraft guns fired, but their crews, weakened by malnutrition, could barely serve the weapons. The British lost 2 personnel, 1 pilot to anti-aircraft fire, 1 crew member to a deck accident, while destroying what little infrastructure remained functional. It was less a battle than a formality, confirming what had been obvious for months. Truk was finished. Japan's surrender in August 1945 came as both relief and humiliation for the garrison. Relief because it meant food, medicine, the end of starvation. Humiliation because they had not fought. They had not died gloriously in battle defending their position. They had simply waited, and starved, and waited more. When American occupation forces finally arrived at Truk in September 1945, they found survivors who could barely stand, men whose bodies had been ravaged by months of inadequate nutrition, facilities that had degraded into ruins not from combat, but from neglect and lack of materials for maintenance. The ships at the bottom of Truk Lagoon remained where they fell. Unlike Pearl Harbor, where salvage operations began almost immediately, no one attempted to raise Truk's wrecks. The water was too deep for easy salvage with 1940s technology. The strategic value was nil. These ships would never sail again. The coral and marine life began colonizing the hulls almost immediately, transforming instruments of war into artificial reefs. Within years, fish populated the holds where trucks and ammunition had once been stored. Coral grew on gun barrels and deck plates. The lagoon became a vast underwater museum, preserving the material evidence of February 17th and 18th, 1944. The long-term legacy of Operation Hailstone extended far beyond Truk itself. The raid demonstrated conclusively that carrier aviation had become the dominant form of naval power in the Pacific. The battleship, which had reigned supreme for decades, could not project power like a carrier task force. Battleships at Truk, the Iowa and New Jersey and Spruance's Surface Action Group, served essentially as escorts and fire support, not as the decisive striking arm. This represented a fundamental shift in naval thinking that would shape fleet composition for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The bypass strategy validated at Truk became American doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. Rather than assault every Japanese-held island, American forces would strike positions critical to the advance toward Japan and isolate the rest. Rabaul, another supposedly impregnable fortress, was bypassed and left to starve exactly as Truk had been. Wake Island, Marcus Island, the various garrisons throughout the Central Pacific, all were isolated and rendered strategically irrelevant. The strategy saved American lives that would have been lost in direct assaults, but it condemned tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors to years of slow death on bypassed islands. For Japanese strategic planning, Operation Hailstone marked the definitive collapse of the outer perimeter defense. The plan had been to hold a chain of fortified positions far from Japan's home islands, making any American advance so costly that negotiation would become preferable to continued war. Truk's fall, and more importantly, its ease, demonstrated that American industrial power could simply overwhelm any static defense. The strategic initiative had passed entirely to the Americans. Japanese forces would fight subsequent battles not to win, but to inflict maximum casualties, hoping that American public opinion would tire of the war's cost. This defensive desperation characterized Japanese operations from Saipan through Okinawa to the final plans for defending the home islands. The psychological impact on American forces was equally significant. Operation Hailstone was the first major carrier operation where American aviators felt genuinely confident of victory before the battle began. At Midway in 1942, at Guadalcanal, at the Eastern Solomons, American success had been uncertain, hard-fought, costly. At Truk, the outcome was never in doubt. This confidence, born of superior numbers, better aircraft, more experienced pilots, and overwhelming material advantage, transformed the psychological dynamic of the Pacific War. American carrier pilots after Hailstone operated with an assurance that bordered on casualness. They expected to win, and they did. The material lessons were studied intensely by naval planners. The effectiveness of continuous small strikes versus massed attacks became doctrine. The importance of submarine rescue services for preserving experienced pilots led to permanent submarine patrols near target areas. The vulnerability of bases to carrier strikes influenced post-war thinking about forward deployment and base hardening. The United States Navy of the Cold War, with its emphasis on carrier strike groups and expeditionary operations, was in many ways the intellectual descendant of Task Force 58's operations in 1944. But perhaps the most profound legacy was what Operation Hailstone revealed about the nature of industrial warfare. War in the Pacific had become less about courage, tactical brilliance, or even strategic insight, and more about production capacity, logistics, and the ability to project power across vast distances. Japan had entered the war with some of the world's finest naval aviators, excellent aircraft, and reasonable strategic planning. By February 1944, none of these advantages mattered. The United States could produce ships faster than Japan could sink them, train pilots faster than Japan could kill them, and manufacture aircraft in quantities Japan could not hope to match. The wrecks in Truk Lagoon became a tourist destination decades after the war, drawing scuba divers from around the world to explore what Jacques Cousteau would famously call the world's greatest graveyard of ships. Divers swim through the holds of the Fujisan Maru, where trucks still sit on their chassis 70 feet below the surface. They explore the San Francisco Maru, where Japanese tanks remain secured in the cargo hold, their metal slowly dissolving into the tropical water. The Rio de Janeiro Maru, with her name still visible in both Roman and Japanese characters, has become one of the most photographed wrecks in the lagoon. Beer bottles, sake cups, gas masks, personal effects, all preserved in the anaerobic environment of the deep lagoon, provide intimate glimpses of the lives interrupted on February 17, 1944. These tourist dives carry an unintended irony. The ships Japan sent to Truk to support military operations sunk in an attack meant to eliminate Japanese naval power, now support an entirely different economy based on tourism and recreation. The instruments of war have become tourist attractions. The sight of Japan's catastrophic defeat generates revenue for the modern nation of Micronesia. History has transformed tragedy into commerce, though the bones of the ships remain as testimony to what happened in those 2 days. The 33,000 men of Truk's garrison who faced starvation after being bypassed represented a particular cruelty of 20th century warfare, the abandonment of forces that had become strategically expendable. They were not defeated in battle. They were simply left behind, victims of a strategic calculus that measured their lives against other priorities and found them insufficient to justify the resources required for relief or evacuation. Modern military ethics debates still grapple with the moral dimensions of such decisions. Is it permissible to knowingly condemn one's own forces to death by starvation if doing so serves larger strategic objectives? The question has no comfortable answer. The garrison that survived to surrender in August 1945 carried with them the psychological scars of 18 months' isolation and starvation. They returned to Japan itself starved, bombed, and defeated. Many found their hometowns destroyed by American bombing raids. The unique suffering of the Truk garrison became one suffering among millions in a nation that had experienced atomic weapons, conventional firebombing, starvation, and military collapse. Their story disappeared into the larger narrative of Japanese defeat, one small tragedy amid a national catastrophe. But the lesson of Truk extended beyond the immediate war. It demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, position matters less than mobility, fortification less than flexibility, static defense less than the capacity to project power. The military theorist who once wrote that the defense is the stronger form of combat had assumed a relatively stable battlefield where defenders could prepare positions and force attackers to come to them at disadvantage. Operation Hailstone proved that when the attacker possessed sufficient industrial capacity to overwhelm any position without direct assault, the supposed strength of defense became a trap. The Truk garrison had been in the strongest possible defensive position: islands, reefs, fortifications, artillery. They had also been completely helpless to prevent their own destruction. This helplessness in the face of overwhelming material power characterized much of the Second World War's later stages. German cities burned under thousand-bomber raids. Japanese cities disappeared in firestorms. Armies were destroyed not through tactical brilliance, but through simple weight of numbers and industrial output. The war became, in many ways, a contest of production as much as combat. The nation that could produce more tanks, more aircraft, more ships, more ammunition would eventually prevail regardless of tactical considerations. America's industrial capacity, built on vast natural resources, technological sophistication, and an economy physically isolated from the fighting, proved decisive. By February 1944, Japan was fighting a war it had already lost in the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, and the shipyards of California. The morning Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Okazaki had watched from the deck of the Hoyo Maru. That quiet dawn before the storm represented the last moment when Truk's garrison could believe they served a meaningful purpose. Within hours, that belief would be destroyed as thoroughly as the ships in the lagoon. The men at Truk had been told they were defending an impregnable fortress. They discovered they were guarding a target. They had been assured their suffering would serve the empire. They learned they had been abandoned to strategic irrelevance. The promises that structure military life, that sacrifice serves a purpose, that endurance will be rewarded, that the nation remembers its defenders, all proved hollow for the men who died slowly on Truk's islands while the war moved on without them. The 45 ships resting on the bottom of Truk Lagoon tell a story about the nature of warfare in the industrial age. They speak of the collision between military doctrine based on fortification and an enemy capable of projecting overwhelming power from mobile platforms. They demonstrate what happens when material production capacity becomes the decisive factor in war, when courage and tactical skill matter less than the ability to manufacture weapons faster than the enemy can destroy them. They mark the moment when a major naval power discovered that its entire strategic paradigm had become obsolete, that every assumption upon which its war planning rested was no longer valid. But they also tell a human story. In the holds of the Fujisan Maru, among the trucks and equipment, were letters from home that would never be delivered, supplies for men who would never receive them, material for defenses that would never be built. The crews who went down with these ships some instantly in the explosions, some slowly as compartments flooded, died believing they served a strategic purpose. The garrison that survived to face starvation endured believing their suffering mattered. The truth was darker. They had become expendable the moment American industrial power reached the point where bypassing them cost less than defeating them. This perhaps is Operation Hailstone's deepest lesson. War reduces human beings to units in strategic calculations. When those calculations determine that certain units are too expensive to save or eliminate, they are simply left behind. The mathematics are precise. The human cost is incalculable. The 33,000 men at Truk, the crews of the 45 ships, the pilots of the 275 aircraft, all became data points in a larger equation about how to reach Japan's home islands at acceptable cost to American forces. They were not evil. They were not incompetent. They were not even necessarily defeated in traditional military terms. They were simply irrelevant, and in industrial warfare, strategic irrelevance is a death sentence. The war in the Pacific would continue for another 18 months after Operation Hailstone. More battles, more casualties. The meat grinder of Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The final collapse and surrender. Throughout all of this, the garrison at Truk slowly starved on their bypassed islands, forgotten by both sides until surrender made them someone else's problem. Their suffering changed nothing about the war's outcome. Their endurance served no strategic purpose. They simply existed and died, and waited for a war to end that had already moved past them. In the final accounting, Operation Hailstone succeeded completely. It destroyed Truk as a functioning naval base. It enabled the American advance through the Central Pacific. It demonstrated the supremacy of carrier aviation and validated the bypass strategy. It achieved all its objectives at minimal cost to American forces. By every measurable military standard, it was a triumph of planning, execution, and strategic vision. Yet the triumph rested on a foundation of industrial power that made the outcome inevitable. The 70 Hellcats that swept over Truk on the morning of February 17th were not brilliant. They were numerous. The 25 aircraft America lost could be replaced within days. The Intrepid, damaged by the lone successful Japanese attack, would be repaired and returned to service. Everything America lost could be replaced. Nothing Japan lost could be. That asymmetry, more than any tactical decision or strategic insight, determined Operation Hailstone's outcome and ultimately the Pacific War itself. The sun rose over Truk Lagoon on February 17, 1944, revealing a fortress prepared for battle. It is set in a graveyard. In between lay 2 days that changed the course of the Pacific War and sealed the fate of 33,000 men. The ships at the bottom of the lagoon remain there still, silent testimony to the moment when Japan's doctrine of fortress defense met America's revolution in naval warfare and crumbled into ruin beneath the weight of industrial power it could never hope to match. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.